Welcome to A Working Title, a podcast that offers a unique perspective on the various paths to success. We dive into the stories and experiences of those who are in the thick of it, those who are navigating the early stages of their journey. These are the voices that often go unheard, yet they offer valuable insight and lessons for us all. We believe that everyone's journey is deserved to be shared and worth celebrating, no matter how big or small the steps taken may be. Whether it's a career move, a business venture, or even a major life decision, we explore the highs and the lows of those who are taking the bold leaps of faith. Join us as we gather honest and authentic conversations that offer a glimpse into the hopes, fears, and dreams of those who are hoping to make their mark into the world. Success is never guaranteed, but the journey itself is always worth the ride. So, I was really thinking about how I wanted to start this, and I hope you won't mind me beginning with this, but I'm going to throw back to the first time that we actually properly met, which was back in Bali. And something that I instantly noticed about you was just this crazy energy, this like free flowing like girl who's just kind of like on the dance floor going absolutely crazy. And I honestly remember thinking to myself, like, where the hell does that come from? Like, it's just so raw and it's so natural. And like, I thought there's no better place to start than there. So where does this come from? Have you always had it, or is it just something that like you've developed and grown into?
Do you know what? I suppose that is something that a lot of people notice within me, and I think it is it used to be a bigger part of my personality, but now it's kind of only really brought out when like certain people are around, or I'm like just really feeling free and fun and flirty and just like my wild self. But I think, yeah, I have always been known as that kind of crazy clown character, and for a long time in my life I kind of used that as a bit of a mask because I knew that it got people's attention in a good way. And I think as I got older and I learned to like accept myself a little bit more and just be at peace with who I was, like all around, like all around the clock, as opposed to just one part. I think I stopped needing that so much. But it wasn't to say that that mask wasn't also like a part of my personality. It was just one that I'd started to use as a crutch in order to kind of gain people's approval, I think. So yeah, I think Max and Anya, your very close friends, like they definitely bring that crazy energy out of me because I feel like a kid again, and I love that so much. But yeah, I think most of the time now I'm much more chill and I'm much more zen.
I personally thought it seemed incredibly organic. I wouldn't have known that it was a crutch to maybe, I don't know, like facilitate other parts of your life. It seems so natural and so free, and I think I particularly found resonance to it because I'm probably a bit more on the opposite end of the spectrum. I'm a bit more reserved. I'm a bit more calculated. I think about what I do, and it was something where I looked at you and I was like, gosh, I need to be a bit more like that. I need to, like bring the best part out of me, and maybe that's why we got on back in the day, because it was we were kind of like giving out each other a little bit of something. But yeah, it's interesting that you say that you use it as a crutch. I mean, given the hindsight that you've got now, was it anything in particular, like reason that you were using it, or was it just a general sort of like backstop, I guess?
So I think what I've kind of learned along the way is that like people with low self-esteem go one of two ways. People with low self-esteem, they either become really quiet and try to shrink themselves in a social environment, or they will attempt to become the loudest and most kind of clownish, confident person in the room to sort of mask the fact that actually they have low self-esteem. And I definitely went in the loud direction, which was ironic because then when I actually had the spotlight and when I had someone giving me one-to-one attention, I felt like a deer in headlights. I was very much like, oh my God, I don't know how to react to this. I'm happy when it's like a crowd of people laughing and yeah, I'm kind of content in that environment. But when it's one-to-one, or when I'm getting like, when I was on stage, for example, or in front of a camera, I would freeze. Like one of my best friends, Christina, still laughs at me for this. Like whenever some sort of camera would be put in my face, I would literally go, because I really, although I was kind of presenting as this like loud, clownish, bubbly person, I was terrified of actually being seen because I did ultimately have really low self-esteem.
What, I guess the first question is, how did you identify that you had low self-esteem? And secondly, what did you try and do in order to build that up?
So it was quite a challenging one, to be honest, because when you present as that mask, when you wear that mask, everybody tells you that you're confident. They're like, oh my God, you're so confident, I wish I was like you. And it was so bizarre because people were telling me that and I was like, I like, I don't feel confident, I just feel loud and annoying. And I think it's a really bizarre thing to unpack, and the reason that it came up was because I identified an area in which my confidence was just nothing. Like it genuinely felt like there wasn't a floor for me to stand on, and that was within education. So when I was doing my degree, I noticed that any sort of prospect of failure or getting it wrong or like not getting it perfect, I was terrified, but not on a level of like, oh, I'm scared I'm going to get it wrong. It felt like I was like facing death. Like it was so terrifying for me. And I was really lucky to have a family member who kind of sort of helped me through that period. And he's a psychoanalyst, and he sort of turned to me and he said, I think you've got low self-esteem because it's kind of showing up in this area. And then I started to do more research on it and was like, okay, it's possible that this sort of confident, bubbly mask I've been wearing is to cover up the fact that I am really quite insecure and like low in self-esteem. So yeah, that's how I kind of identified it. But it was a really bizarre time in my life because I did have other friends that were so quiet that identified as like not confident. And I was like, well, I don't do that. I don't go shy. So why do I feel this but not look like it, you know? Because I don't think it's something that's generally known.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that being shy, I mean, I'd say being shy is more of a stereotype of someone with lower self-esteem, and therefore it's maybe less easy for you to identify at the time that it was low self-esteem because, yeah, on the surface of it, you had created this bubble. And as I say, I mean, you know, I clearly kind of fell for it at the same time because it seemed like you were, yeah, had all the confidence in the world. And I think actually it can be quite tiring, can't it? You know, when you're trying to, I guess, like, yeah, be something that you're ultimately not. And, or maybe that you are, but you just amplify it to try and, yeah, like feel more comfortable within that situation. It's really interesting, actually. It's not, I wouldn't say that's super common or from my experience so far anyway. And yeah, no wonder it was quite hard to identify it.
Yeah, I mean, I think to be honest, the version that you saw like was definitely very authentic. Like I would say now the reason it comes out is very organic. It's because I'm having fun. I feel like a child again. And as I say, like it is a part of my personality. It's just one that when I was younger, I think especially from my mum definitely resembles a lot of the same mannerisms as or I as her. Um, I think I learned that there was a portion of my personality that was celebrated, and that was one that took the piss out of herself, was very clownish and very confident and very loud. But actually, the irony of it was that quite a lot of my jokes and quite a lot of the way that I made people laugh was self-deprecating. So now it's much more organic in that I do just enjoy making people laugh. Back then it was like making jokes despite myself. And I remember reading a book when I was back in uni called You Are a Badass by Jen Sincero. It's like one of the first self-help books I ever read, and I've read it so many times. I love it. But she said, regardless of why you make this self-deprecating joke, and regardless as to whether it lands, it's still a form of like self-deprecation. It's still a form of self-loathing, because you're essentially making yourself the butt of the joke. And that means that sort of people are laughing at your expense. And so that gave me a lot of reflection. I think now I've kind of come out, I've been in the personal development world for 10 years now. And so when I met you properly late last year, I've very much come to understanding myself on all levels. And I think that I can definitely say that the version you saw was extremely authentic, and that portion of me maybe is 15% that's brought out like when I genuinely feel kind of that way. Whereas before it was like I was stretching myself energetically to sort of fill the room and disguise myself from being this person who had low self-esteem.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I think you've clearly done a lot of work, because you're very aware and you can, dive back into those specific scenarios, I guess, relive them and try and learn from them moving forward as well. So how did you work on your self-esteem, and what were the steps that you took in order to, I guess, build that up one block at a time?
Oh God. That's a hard one. That one is one that has come up time and time again, to be honest. I think self-esteem is quite a complex issue. Everybody suffers with low self-esteem for different reasons. And I think the main work that I did on it was when I did somatics. So what I found, I'm going to actually be quite controversial towards my own trade here.
Mhm.
The world of coaching would teach me that like action is what would help me curb my self-esteem issues. And what I mean by that is like what we're taught in the coaching world is often like, okay, self-esteem is directly a cause or a result of self-trust. And self-trust is basically whether or not you do what you say you're going to do, and you show up for yourself. So it's like, okay, I spent the first sort of 5 to 7 years, let's say, in sort of mindset coaching and sort of action-based work of like, okay, if I just do what I say I'm going to do, is my self-worth, self-esteem going to grow? Best answer is probably no. Maybe for some people it does work that way, but for me personally, the wounds that I had were so deep that like me just doing what I say I'm gonna do, I wasn't gonna do it because emotionally my body was rejecting that anyway. And B, me doing it anyway felt like, okay, and what sort of thing. So it was only really when I got into the crux of sort of real trauma release, and moved away from sort of mindset and action-based coaching and more into like deep healing and sort of trauma release. So
Mhm.
that was when I started sort of somatic healing, therapy, like trauma release, inner child work, all stuff that I hold really dear to my heart now. But essentially, the reason for me as to why I had low self-esteem was because so many different parts of me when I was a child felt rejected and felt unloved and felt not understood. And so my journey was about revisiting those parts of myself and giving them what they needed in that moment. And that can't be done by mindset work or action-based stuff. It has to be a more feminine approach of just presence and like, how can I hold myself here? How can I be gentle? How can I offer myself a bit more love. And quite often that doesn't come from sort of dragging yourself to the gym or dragging yourself to doing something you said you're going to do. Which makes me quite angry now when I hear people like, "Oh, you need to do it, Karen."
Yeah, I'm resonating with a lot of that. I think I've gone through a similar journey, having having thought that I could think my way out of almost anything, to realizing that you definitely can't, to realizing that you actually need a bit of everything. Yes, you need to drag yourself to the gym, you need discipline, you need to wake up in the mornings, you need to get sunlight, but you also need to do a lot of internal work, and there are just some barriers that you can't jump over yourself. And it's putting the question in my mind in terms of, how do people know when they can't jump over that barrier themselves, when they need to reach out for help? Because it seems like everyone needs an existential crisis before that period actually happens. And sometimes I wish that, okay, I'll just pause here. In my own personal experience, I, as I say, thought I could outthink everything. And then I was so, I'm very self-aware. I'm in my head all the time. So I know myself really well, and I know what I need. Ha ha ha. And, and then I just hit this phase where I literally felt like I, didn't really want to wake up in the morning, felt pretty low. And it was like a slow trickle into that. It wasn't some sudden period where I was really low. And the only real thing that helped me get out of it was therapy. And it was also little steps at little times, challenging the hurdles that I had sort of like placed in front of me. Yeah, circling back to the question, how do you think you know when you need external help like that?
Needing external help, I think my answer would be that everybody needs.
I agree.
I think if you're a human and you're breathing, I think you need external help. Because like I genuinely think that there's so much of our society that contributes to ways of living that don't meet our needs. Like for people that live in cities and spend their life on their phones, and eat alone and don't have much social interaction, there's so many parts of the puzzle that you're missing there, like having access to nature, having social interactions, like having freedom of expression, doing creative things, like getting active, eating well. Like eating well is now really hard because of soil quality. There's so much in the world now that makes it so difficult for us to live a really genuinely fulfilled life. And that's why A, I'm in Bali, and B, why I think that everybody needs help. Like, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. Like, if, like, I always say this kind of quote, if you wanted to get better at basketball, you would get a basketball coach. If you wanted to get better at life, you would get a life coach. Like, and that's not to say that everybody should get a coach, because I think that sometimes, as I say, you do need someone who's a little bit more present with you. And sometimes that calls for a psychoanalyst, sometimes that calls for a counselor, sometimes that calls for a therapist. And it's important for you to have the courage to be able to try these different methods and see which one's right for you. Like maybe you just dip your toe in the water to start with and you attend some sort of workshop, and then maybe you buy a course, or then maybe you visit a therapist, or maybe you try like BetterHelp, like online therapists. And then maybe you decide that actually you've had enough presence held for you and you'd like to progress, like you'd like to have a bit more fast pace, and then you move to a coach. Like the world of self-help is blossoming at a rapid rate, and that's also taking into consideration that there is a lot of bullshit out there as well, which I'm very familiar with. So I think knowing when you're ready is when your gut and your body sort of turns to you and says, I'd really like some help. And you know when that is. Like you know in your body when you're ready to be sort of held by someone, or just hold a conversation, or just have a hug from someone, or maybe just a phone call. And then maybe that gets bigger and your urge to sort of actually reach out for paid help sort of springs upon you. I think nobody had a perfect childhood. Nobody knows how to function in this world perfectly. Like, your view of your world is so limited. And the whole point of asking for help is that someone else can give you an objective viewpoint on that and sort of say, I think you're missing this, or I think that you could see this a little bit differently.
Hmm.
Like, if we look at NLP, for example, neuro linguistic programming, I can't remember the specific statistics, but I think it's like at every given moment, I'm going to give complete random numbers, but it is like
Yeah, yeah,
something
yeah.
within scale. I think it's like we take in 18,000 bits of information, and at any given moment, there are 3 billion to take from. So if you can imagine, like, how people's perspectives are so narrowed to confirmation biases to their own beliefs, which are created when they're a child, which is only then a very limited view of the world, particularly from an emotional perspective as opposed to a logical one. It's like having someone point out the parts of the story that you didn't notice is so vital for your healing, because then you can sort of break free of that um, sort of limiting view of it, and
Hmm.
maybe be like, oh, okay, this is how maybe it was, or this is maybe sort of a different viewpoint that enables me to breathe a little bit more there, or offer forgiveness, or offer
Hmm.
myself forgiveness, you know? So yeah, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there, but I think having that third person perspective, or just having that other perspective, is just so vital, and like your body will definitely tell you when it's time.
Yeah, I agree. And I think part of that is being aware as well, being in touch with your body, in touch with your mind, understanding what the cues are. And that I think anyone can start at any point. Just holding space for yourself, having time where, even if it's not meditation, if it's just walks, it's just being in nature, having points where you're alone. I think a lot of people struggle to be alone nowadays. And you know even if you're alone, but there's phones and there's technology around you and there's lots of stimulation, it's really difficult. And it's interesting you mentioned inner child work, because I heard something the other day that's really struck a chord with me. And it was essentially this idea that everyone is essentially their 15-year-old selves walking around, no matter what age you are. And the way that you felt when you were 15, or the way that you developed up until the age of 15, is ultimately going to be the reflection of who you are, or somewhat, or it's what the internal mechanisms look like as you sort of approach different situations as an adult. And I think that's where the external help, the therapy, the somatics are really important, because if you don't know who that inner child is, then you are completely oblivious as to the inner functions of how you actually work. And specifically for therapy, I think that's where it's been absolutely vital. Understanding who that person is, why we do what we do, or at least trying to get a better understanding, because I'm not sure that you'll ever fully know, because you're always a developing person. But yeah, it's an interesting thought, and one that I think is definitely worthwhile. But yeah, firstly, you need to be in touch with yourself, don't you?
100%. And I think also something that's also pushed upon people quite a lot is the idea that we're broken as well, and that is so damaging, because um, it makes people believe that they need to sort of change in order to sort of become whole, or like become the best version of themselves. And actually, that idea that you're broken is something that feeds or funds a lot of the personal development world. And it's like, but like a lot of the world today says, buy this and you'll be fixed, sort of thing. um, and actually deconstructing that is so important within someone's mentality of themselves. And enabling them and giving them the platform to believe that they are completely whole, and that the struggles they face are just teaching them something that's going to enable them to function a little easier in life. And that is literally it. And I think something that completely switched my mindset, because something that I have struggled with in my life has been depression. And it's been so difficult for me to sort of, especially when I'm in the depths of it, to be able to turn to myself and say that I will come out of this, that it's going to sort of help me to just be present with myself right now. And to see it as like a positive thing in a way. That has been one of the hardest things. And then I sort of spoke to I was actually doing a podcast with one of my favorite mentors slash therapists, and her name is Raki. She's my somatic coach. And she said to me, what about if depression or being depressed was just deep rest? And if you've been living in your whole life as a dysregulated human, as a nervous system that was never really regulated, you've been living in fight or flight. Like, there's no question about it. If that is the case, if you are dysregulated, you are living in fight or flight. And depression, I can't speak because I'm not a qualified therapist, and I don't have a degree in psychology. I could only speak from my personal experience, which is that I did live in fight or flight for a very long time. And having depression was essentially my nervous system's way of saying, okay, I feel safe. I'm going to shut off for a while. Like, I just need to rest. I just need to be here. And that was 9 months. So it was a very long time.
Gosh.
Yeah, but it was also then one of the best things I ever did for myself, because I learned how to hold myself, A, in deep pain, and B, when I really needed myself. And prior to that, I'd always leaned upon other people, other things, validation to sort of give me that. So yeah, that was a really mad period, but definitely one that switched the game for me.
In that period, when did you first recognize that this might be depression as opposed to a prolonged period of, unrest? I'm trying to think of the right word, because I think people find it hard sometimes to distinguish, I guess, like depression with having something situationally that makes them feel sad, or a few different things in life just not quite going their way, and then that kind of leads into internal self-doubt, etc. Now, obviously, the clinical answer would be when you are diagnosed with depression by a doctor, but I think there's still value in people being self-reflective and trying to understand what's going on with them internally, and of course, yes, getting a diagnosis, but sometimes just having that internal knowledge initially is enough to, I guess, best move through with it. So yeah, when did you first think it was depression as opposed to a period of sadness or unhappiness?
It's funny because I am actually someone who never got diagnosed, and never have been, but there have been periods in my life, like that 9-month one was probably the longest, but I have had periods in my life where I have just shut off. The first time someone mentioned it to me was when I was 17. And she was my first coach, and she basically explained to me that when you allow, so she basically, the way she explained it is that, like, all large ships have these airtight containers at the bottom that enable it to float. And when there is an issue with the ship, there's a hole, or like when there's a hole in each of these air containers, the water spills out into each of these little compartments, and it makes the ship sink. And essentially, she said that's what's happening to your days. You're allowing that day to spill over into that day, and you're like making meaning of the fact that you did nothing and that you sat there, and then that's bleeding into the next day, and it's like that's just then slowly that is what depression is. like my sadness from each day was just leaking into the next day. So she first mentioned it to me then, and that was quite like triggering. I did cry when she said it because I was like, wow, I'm 17 and I've like been experiencing depression. That's wild. And then after that, it was just kind of something that I acknowledged as my reality. I was like, I had kind of surrendered it, but just like I was someone that sometimes needed to just shut the world out and watch movies for 4 weeks straight, or like, and that made it really hard for my career as well. Like being someone that kind of suffered with high functioning depression, um, finding a career that could support that when there are days that I physically couldn't get out of bed, um, was really challenging. But after the 9 month period last year, I kind of looked at it and sort of said, okay, that was me being depressed. But I don't think at any point during it, I thought I was just functioning the best that I could, because I was still sort of going to work in a restaurant, and I was still sort of dog sitting, although I was becoming quite reliant on the people around me, which was a telltale sign that I was sort of needing help, you know?
Hmm.
So hard to tell. I think I have all of the symptoms, or I have had all the symptoms, but I think that there's been too much shame attached to me going to the doctor, slash I wouldn't have probably accepted any of the remedies that they'd given me, which would probably be CBT therapy or medication. And quite often it's medication, and I just wasn't interested.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a fantastic analogy. I think a lot of people are going to resonate with that. And it's very true in terms of when you are low and you are down, you often look to the previous days in order to understand how you're going to feel for that day. Whereas when you're happy and when you're light and you're feeling fresh, all you do is look to the future and you're thinking, it's all automatic. It's all, oh, what fun things can I do? And yeah, the reflection is intense a lot of the time. And yeah, I think it's really difficult, especially when you're so young, to go through that when you're 17. They're very formative years. To not be able to trust your mental health, I guess, at that point, it must have been a difficult thing to go through at such a poignant age.
It was really, really bizarre, but I mean, I'm personally someone that believes in like, I'm a very spiritual person. And I think looking back on it now, I wouldn't change it for the world, because like it's how I got into what I do now, and it's how I fell in love with this world. And like, even though it was just very coincidence as to how things happened, like when I was 17, I remember sort of the world feeling like it was sort of coming in on me, and I felt like the walls were like right in front of my face. I couldn't breathe. I was coming home from college at like 3, and then I would just sleep until 8 p.m., maybe eat something and go back to sleep until the next day, and repeat that for weeks. And my mum went to the doctor with me thinking it was an iron deficiency, but like obviously at the time they didn't really know the telltale signs for depression in a 17-year-old. So yeah, I think I, at that point, just randomly reached out to a family friend and just said, I am struggling and I have no idea who to talk to, but you feel like someone who feels safe. And she said, come to my house next Thursday. And then I went to her house, and within 2 hours, it felt like she'd lifted the world off of my shoulders. And it turned out that she was training to be a life coach, and she'd just given me a coaching session.
Hmm. How full circle is that?
I know.
But, yeah. And that brings me nicely on to life coaching. How you've been diving into that journey since I met you, really. And there's been quite a lot of change in your life generally. I think change of career and moving to Bali. But we can begin with life coaching. What was it initially that attracted you about becoming a life coach? Was it in fact that scenario that you've just explained, which really sort of first opened your eyes to the profession?
Yes and no. I think at that point, I had no like intention of sort of doing it myself. It was only when I then went to uni, and I always tell this story, I bet she's so sick of it. My best friend went through sort of a mental breakdown almost exactly like I did when I was 17. And by that point, I was, I don't know, it must have been about 4 years later. No, maybe 2 or 3 years later. Anyway, by that point, I'd had a certain amount of coaching. And when she started going through what I had been through, I was like, right, okay, I can just regurgitate the information. Like, I can just support her from a friend's perspective and just regurgitate the information that I've been given in when I'm in crisis or been in crisis. And it was only when we got to the end of our uni experience, and like I had been so fascinated with the topic ever since. So like watching every talk available, listening to personal development audiobooks, and just going wild with it, just as a passion project alongside my degree. And then we both got to the end of the degree, and she was like, Meredith, you have literally changed my life for the better. Why aren't you doing this as a profession? And I was like, oh yeah. So then a year later, when we fell into kind of lockdown and all that chaos, I then started studying it. I bought a course and have been studying it ever since. So I've had coaching / therapy for the last 10 years, and I've been training to be a coach for the last 3. So yeah, and then I actually started becoming a coach back when I moved to Bali in September of 2022. So it's now been 8 months.
Gosh, yeah, that's quite a journey. And I guess for people that don't know or find it hard to differentiate, a life coach with a therapist, with a counselor, there are so many different sources of help out there. What's the sort of the USP of a life coach, let's say, versus a counselor or a therapist, or another sort of body of mental health aid, I guess?
So coaches generally, at the moment, coaches are kind of gaining themselves a bad name. I think coaching is more towards progression. So kind of like that basketball reference I used earlier. Let's go with this basketball reference. So
I love it. Let's go.
If you were learning to become a basketball player, you would hire a basketball coach. And it's the same with sort of, if you feel in your life that you'd like to improve at your job, relationship with money, relationship with friends, partner, just life in general, like your mentality, then you would hire a life coach. That's the typical meaning. If you were a basketball player and you had a broken leg, you wouldn't go to a basketball coach, you would go to the hospital, or you would go to a physiotherapist. And that's a similar sort of thing with sort of counselor, therapist. And that's not to say that you are broken. I really want to reiterate that point.
Just an example.
It's just an example, but to kind of say that you feel that maybe you are suffering with something like depression, or there's something really much deeper that needs to be dealt with, as opposed to just some sort of like some journal prompts or some some mindset work. If you feel that there's something deeper, or you can identify something in your past that you feel you would like some support with, that's when you look to more sort of presence. And what I mean by presence is that when you are processing a really hard emotion, the last thing you need is advice. Because in that moment, all you need to know is that your emotions are valid. So that's why it's really tough. I remember, was it you that recommended that that Netflix series of What's His Face?
Yeah, Stutz. The Jonah Hill documentary with his therapist. Fantastic. Please go watch it if you haven't. It's so good.
It's amazing. But one of the first things he says is that like you crave advice from your therapist, and like you crave support from your friends, but quite often you get the opposite. So you get the support from the therapist and the space and the just like the nothingness. And then with your friends, all they do is tell you what they think you should do. So what I would say is that typically when you are choosing sort of what help you might need, it's whether or not you feel that you have some sort of deep stuff that you need to process. I personally believe that like everybody can do with some deep healing and everybody can function with a therapist. But whether or not you should take on a coach is whether or not you feel stable and able to go, okay, I'm ready to sort of level up. With that being said, this is a very long and complicated answer.
Please, I'm welcoming it.
That being said, like typically there are people that fall under the bracket of coaching, but actually are much more space holders and much more people that hold sort of presence. And those sorts of people come under the category of like, they might talk about inner child work and sort of somatic healing. Like the person that changed my life for the better is my somatic coach. But in my eyes, she is something of sort of a therapist and sort of much more of what I would reference as a feminine style of healing, which is much more presence and much more holding, as opposed to a masculine approach, which is more doing, mindset, moving forward. Do you see
I do. And I think naturally the approach that a coach will take will vary on the client they obviously have at the time, right? And sticking with the basketball analogy, because I think we can go further with this one. You say that, you'd find a basketball coach if you want to be better at basketball, but a basketball player would also have a nutritionist, you're right, a physio, they might have a team doctor. So a life coach is just one of the many pieces of the puzzle that a person needs in order to be the best version of themselves, right, or version of themselves. And I think it's only really up to the individual to try and explore and to test which one works for them. There'll be periods in your life where you feel like you want to, find added value with life coaching, but also where you might need a therapist to, uncover that past work. And ultimately, there's a bit of exploration that will be involved. Somatic healing, something that I actually don't know loads about, if I'm honest. Could you enlighten me?
Of course. So I didn't know much about it either. It kind of ties into what I was talking about with coaching versus therapy, in that, like, actually, no, it doesn't. It basically supports the idea that our minds can get us so far. And the way that we sort of tell our story, sort of if we look at it from the NLP perspective again, of like, we've lived in this life of taking in 18,000 pieces of information each time. We can get so far, but then quite a lot of our trauma is actually stored within the body. And if, for example, something that I personally experienced was like, if you have a particular trauma within your past that is too sensitive for your brain to revisit, your ego will switch it off. So you will dissociate, you will sort of, another one for me was freeze response. That's another whole story. But essentially, somatic healing supports the idea that we can visit trauma within the body and just release it. And releasing it is essentially just feeling it. Like emotion, in some people's kind of definition, is energy in motion. And it basically means that any emotion that we experience just wants to move, just wants to come out. And the easiest way to do that is just enable that part of you to feel safe and feel valid. So somatic healing essentially draws attention away from the chatter of your mind, but away from the way that you tell the story, because sometimes we can get caught in loops there, in victim mindset and all that jazz. So somatic healing essentially goes, okay, what does this part of you say? And it will be like a part of your heart, or like your gut, or your leg, or your foot, or your hand. And it will be, okay, so what does that part of you need? Can you offer that part of you? Like, how do you feel towards that part of you? And sometimes it will be inner child work. Sometimes, like in my somatic healing, I've like been inside of me, let's say, and I've like been in, say, my heart area, and I've like looked around, and there's been like a small toddler version of me, and she's just sat in the corner, kind of looking around. And my somatic coach sort of speaks to me very much in a very relaxed state. And she'll say, okay, why is that part of you there? And so I'll just speak to her and I'll be like, why are you here? And she'll sort of look at me like, how did you get here? It's a really kind of, it's somatics is like quite hard to wrap your head around because it's not very tangible, it's not very
Mm,
conventional. But you just have to kind of go with the flow and trust it. And the more you lean in, the more like value you gain from it. But it
mm.
was a really transforming, sort of transformative part of my journey for sure.
What do some of those practices look like in terms of I'm trying to imagine like, you know, some specific practices or approaches. What type of work does it sort of incorporate?
What somatics?
Mm.
So with for my personal journey, like I met a somatic healer via Instagram. I messaged her. Um, and so what happens is you kind of sit in a space. So I opted to sort of do it in person with her as opposed to via Zoom because I knew that what I wanted to visit was quite delicate.
Mm.
And I really wanted to feel like I was in an enclosed space, sort of in a safe space, let's say. So, what she'll do with you is it's really not that conventional at all. She'll just attempt to get you in a very meditative state. And then she'll essentially try and draw your consciousness downwards.
Mm.
And so what happens is if she asks you a certain question, she'll just ask you a series of questions basically. And then if you start going up and chattering away, she'll okay, you're in your mind, go back down. And so the way to tell if you're sort of speaking from the body versus the mind is that the mind will give you conversation, story, and sort of perspective, whereas the body just gives you emotion
Mm.
or color, or it'll be like a one-word answer. So like, where's the pain? Heart. What does it look like? Green. What does it smell like? So I don't know. So it's like, because at that point in your life, the reason your body held on to it, your body was just going via senses. It
Mm.
wasn't paying attention to anything that was going on in the mind. It was purely going based on senses. And that's why how you know is like via just very one word answers.
Mm. That is fascinating. I think there's so much that we don't know about the relationship between the mind and the body even today. There are, I mean, you know, I've been following a bit of Gabor Mate's work about trauma and inner childhood trauma, eventually leading to, you know, arthritis as you get older. So, I mean, there are so many different illnesses that they say are sort of like stress related, and I think that's another reason why having this sort of like whole team approach in terms of life coaching, therapy, somatics, it's, you know, do whatever you can to try and better yourself, but also just you're right, be comfortable with yourself, you know, try and give yourself a compassionate outlook. It's a lot harder than I think people think, and everyone goes on their own journey, right? But yeah, the relationship between the mind and the body is fascinating. And for me specifically, the part where how mental is pain, how mental is pressure, stress, and you know, it's almost like do you approach it from a mentality perspective first, i.e., I'm going to you know, out muscle my body by using the power of my mind. And you see people like Wim Hof doing this with the cold therapy and being able to, you know, like hike up Everest with no shoes on, etc. You know, you could argue that's mental willpower, or is that something else? Is it something spiritual? I mean, how do we know that? For me, there are so many unanswered questions. Or the other strand, I guess, is yeah, do you go from that like body first approach, i.e., you know, take care of like the whole wellness side, etc., and therefore you'll alleviate your mind from the stresses of that pain as well. But yeah, what's been your relationship with mind vs body so far? Any insight?
You know, just from that question and the way that you've articulated yourself there, I can definitely tell that you think so much. Like you have got such an analytical brain because you've gone in so many different directions there.
Oh yeah, that's a little insight into what goes on with me, and I think actually as you're speaking, things are firing away left, right, and centre, and I'm having to regulate myself and say, no, ask this question because that's irrelevant. Because I just want to keep going, going, going. Okay,
Same,
you're.
don't worry. That's why we get along so well.
I know, very good insight there, Meredith.
Sorry, I'm gonna have to ask you what the question was again.
Please go ahead. Go ahead. I did go on a significant tangent. The question was, what has been your relationship between the mind and the body?
Yeah. Okay, so um I lived for a long time in the mind, um, because that was my safe space. I think that's many people's safe space. Um, and I really did feel, I didn't even know that I felt disconnected from my body until I actually realized what it meant to be in my body and to be present and to be like, oh, okay, I'm just here, and that's cool. um, so my relationship with my body felt like learning how to use a skill that had been there the whole time and benefited me so much. And then when I learned how to use it, was like as easy as breathing.
Mm,
Um, it's kind of like I feel that the mind can take you in so many different directions, and that's why I made that point. But your body just has this knowing. And so asking your body a question is like, do I enjoy this? No. Do I want to spend time with this person? Yes. Do I want to pursue this as a career? Yes. Like they are very yes, no answers. And quite often I find that my heart and my gut will say two different things, or sometimes
mm,
they'll be in sync. But it's such a yes or no answer. Whereas the mind will go, well, what about this? And what about if, my auntie might give me this? And what if I turn this corner and and it's like, it's so like, almost for me anyway, it was exhausting. And I found that like, especially when I was in an anxious state, um, I found it really hard to just get anywhere because my brain would just sabotage me and giving me a million different options. So I'm taking an inhale just even thinking about it now.
I noticed. I noticed.
So building a relationship with my body and learning sort of the power of intuition and the power of just listening to yes or no from this way as opposed to this way, um, has been the most powerful thing that I've ever done, and is now, as I say, as easy as breathing. Um, but I definitely think that the world typically now supports more mentality based sort of progression. And that's because as humans, that's where we feel most safe. But if you think about it, like, I can't remember who said this. I think it's featured in a book called Emotional Intelligence, but like bodies. So if we think about like sort of evolution, I'm not going to be able to quote this with too much sort of accuracy, but like bodies were developed so much quicker or so much sooner than sort of brains.
Mm,
So in order to, so our instincts, if you think about it, were developed so much sooner than our sort of thinking mind was. And that means that there's so much intelligence down here that we're not paying attention to, like our instincts and our ability to sort of read a scenario, determine whether or not we like something, determine whether or not we like someone. There's so much going on down here that's receptive. But also another thing that I learned recently when I was doing Reiki 1 was the fact that our nervous system doesn't stop with our skin. We can detect things as far as our arms sort of will go out, our arms sort of span.
really?
So that's and like, yeah. So like we as humans have like a radar, and that's why the term arm's length, keep someone at arm's length, is because you're not allowing them into your energy field. Um, Whether or not you believe in that is kind of up to you. But like, I think there's a reason that when you're in someone's close personal space, you either feel comfortable or you don't feel comfortable.
Mm.
And there's that sort of instinct is instant. Like you can feel it straight away. And that's something that, like, I would say if people wanted to sort of get in touch more with their body, that's something to pay attention to. It's just when you start to feel things in your body that's like, I feel comfortable, I don't. I'm hungry, I'm not. I'm full, I'm hot, I'm cold. Like your body is constantly telling you things, and that's something to really pay attention to.
Mm. And for you, what are those sensations like in terms of when you're going through the somatic therapy and you're being asked to notice things within your body? Are there any like similar patterns that happen? Do you usually like feel sensations within similar parts, or does it very much vary on what the approach is at the time?
Uh the easiest way I can describe it is like, when you hear that typical scene that everyone talks about when you're on a train staring or a car and you're staring out of a rainy window and you've got your headphones in and you just kind of run away with yourself. That's what I would describe it as close as. You're sort of feeling things, you're coming up with ideas, you're noticing things. Um, but you're also noticing that those things were always there. Um, Maybe you just hadn't been tuning into them. So, sort of the biggest example I would say is when going back to what you said about knowing when to sort of pick yourself up and push yourself to sort of do something in a day as opposed to actually resting. And I think the biggest indication that your body gives you is when you should push yourself to do something and when you should rest. And for me, that shows up as, I kind of described it in a content video the other day, which is like discipline should feel like dragging a tired toddler to school, and it shouldn't feel like dragging an angry cat through a bush. Um,
That is brilliant. That is brilliant.
if your whole body is going no, then you should not be pushing yourself in that moment. And that's one of the biggest indications your body will give you. Whereas if your body's kind of going, I don't want to, then you're like, okay, yes, I could probably benefit from this.
That is, I'm just reliving all the times when I really didn't want to go to the gym, but I'm also sitting horizontally on a sofa watching something really fun, and it's like that's when my body's going, oh, do you have to go? Like, do I really have? As opposed to, like 6 o'clock in the morning, 3 hours sleep the night before, really tough day at work, and then I go, yeah, literally, the cat is screaming inside, and it's not happy. And that just, do you know what? Just even you saying that and hearing that analogy, I'm now going to, every time I do something, I'm now going to think, okay, I'm going to check in with myself. Think about, is this a cat? Is this a toddler? Which one do I go for? Is it something that's leaning towards either end? It's actually a really, really great litmus test to understand whether you actually want to do something or not, whether your body wants to do it. That is fantastic. Wow, what
I
a great
love
bit of
that that's
insight.
the thing that I'm eventually known for, when coming up with the analogy of like discipline. Is it the cat or the toddler?
We love a good analogy. The one about depression earlier and having the little holes in the boat and it bleeding into one day. Fantastic, cat versus toddler. Wow, you're on a roll, Meredith. Amazing. Yeah, it's really insightful, and I think it's really valuable to understand. You're right, when discipline isn't the answer actually to everything, when to give yourself a break, when to be compassionate, because I think we're in this culture nowadays where you've got the likes of podcast after podcast being about improving yourself, self-development, which, don't get me wrong, is really important, but I've definitely noticed myself leaning into the trend of constantly feeling like I need to be better every single day, no matter what. And it has to be a linear progression path. And I think what you realize is that process is actually exhausting. If you're constantly asking more of yourself, you're constantly wanting to improve on various things within your life, it becomes more of a project than something you actually enjoy. it's more of a task, it's more of a tick the box, as opposed to, is this actually giving me value, benefit, purpose? And the compassion side, I think, is the antidote to that. It's when I don't do it, I'm okay with not doing it because that's what I needed in that moment. And it's just weighing up where do I want to be in, 10, 15, 20 years or whatever is, who do I want to be, maybe is the more important question. But also balancing the present life. It's like, what am I going to do at the moment that's going to give me, satisfaction, that's going to, mean that I enjoy living today as opposed to my life in general. And I find that's a battle that I struggle with quite a lot. I don't know about you.
100%. Yeah, I think the key word you used there was compassion, and like, I would say to anyone sort of embarking on any sort of personal development journey, the first and most powerful thing you can offer yourself in any moment is just the compassion to say, like, I deserve love in this moment. Like, and that is, although so, like, what seems sort of so menial, so like small, is fucking, excuse my French, huge. When it's repeated and when it's sort of felt, like you can say something until you begin to feel it. And for me, that's how it started, was sort of faking it until you make it, like offering yourself love in every moment. And so what does love look like right now? Okay, love looks like me pushing myself a little bit so that I can feel good from a workout, or me choosing not to spend time with this person because they don't make me feel very good, or choosing to quit my job and move to Bali because that's what one of my life goals is. Like, what does love look like in this moment is a question that I have repetitively asked myself, and has always given me the right answer, or one that serves me the best,
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the best books that I ever read, I think if you're someone that suffers particularly with an inner critic, which comes from low self-esteem and low confidence, is self-compassion. And one of the stories that she talks about, which I really, really love, is like, she has this autistic child and she's on a flight, and the flight's going really well. And then all of a sudden this child starts to feel really overwhelmed and has a little bit of a manic fit. And so what she does is she's trying all these different methods of trying to calm him down, and nothing is working. And so she sits on the floor with this child in the middle of the aisle who's having this manic sort of panic fit thing. She just sits on the floor and puts both of her hands on her heart and goes, I deserve love in this moment. I deserve love in this moment. I deserve love in this moment. And the magical thing was that as she started to regulate her nervous system, this child then started to calm down.
Mm.
And that's the wonderful thing about self-love, is that it not only benefits you, but it starts to regulate you, and then sort of set the tone for sort of the environment around you.
Mm. Yeah, you're only as fit to help other people until you help yourself. And I think that's, again, definitely a trap that a lot of people fall into, is they actually try to help other people so that then they can feel better about themselves, right? And give themselves more purpose. It's an interesting one, because when you're talking about compassion and sort of being, I guess, an antidote to that self-critic, I'm thinking about how people approach children and what you do with a child if, they are upset, or if they're being hard on themselves at school, or they have a tough day at school. With a supportive network around you, it's usually faced with compassion. And, I think we talk about this idea of everyone being a 15-year-old child in an adult's body, or whatever age. There was some poignant things happening in your life, but ultimately it is really about giving yourself compassion and that internal relationship with yourself. And I wonder how much attention people put on that nowadays with all the things going on in your life, with the your work or whatever it might be. I wonder whether there's enough focus on the relationship with the self. How have you managed to develop that over the last few years?
It's been a tough one, I'm not gonna lie. Like, quite a lot of the times I've definitely revisited dark places, and I think that that's all part of being human, right? Like, the point is to stay detached from any state that you're ever in, because it's always temporary. And for me, being human is to experience the vast range of emotions that we can, and have the capacity to, and just feeling comfortable in them. So learning to hold myself through deep pain over and over and over again does mean that in any given scenario, I am so grounded and so confident very naturally, and it's not from a superficial place, um, because I know that regardless of anything, I am able to hold myself. And that also means that, like, through any breakup, through any sort of hard situation, yes, okay, it still hits me. But back in the day when I was 17 and I had no sense of confidence or self-esteem, it would knock me for six. And that was when I used to spend days on end, weeks on end, months on end in bed. Um, Whereas now I'll experience something and I'll wobble for a little bit, maybe for a couple of hours a day or two. I'll need to hold myself again. But I know where my true north is, and I know where I am, and I know where this sense of sort of grounding is. Um, so it's taken a long time to develop, but ultimately choosing myself in a scenario where, for example, I've had the option to set a boundary or do something to please someone, or like do something that everybody expects of me, i.e., go into a conventional job and work a 9 to 5, or do what my heart's calling is and sort of move across the world. So those micro moments of choosing yourself is what ultimately builds up this relationship, as well as being able to hold yourself through like really hard emotions. And no emotions are good or bad, they're just either harder or easier to experience.
Hmm.
Really being able to hold myself in those moments as well has just meant that this sense of myself is so strong. Like, and I'm really proud of that, I have to say.
Hmm. And look where those moments have got you today. You're currently joining us from Bali. Can't say I'm not incredibly jealous. But that was a major transition for you. I mean, when I was last out there, and I think when we first sort of properly met, you had only maybe been there for a couple of weeks at that point, and it was, moving to a different house, to a different city in the UK, people find stressful and is tough. Moving to an entirely different country on your own, my word, that's quite a jump. And but one that I think clearly has been the right decision. I actually hesitated when I said right decision, because I don't know whether there was a right or wrong decision really. It's just a decision that someone makes, and you've got to go with it. But what was the ultimate reason for moving, and was there a specific catalyst that sort of brought that on?
Yeah, I suppose it kind of circles back to what I said about having a relationship with your body. The more and more at that time I was living in Brighton and I was doing that somatic healing, and the one message that just kept coming from my gut was like, get to Bali, get to Bali, get to Bali, get to Bali. And this is also why I'm very spiritual, because I do believe that this was sort of me aligning with my path in a way. But I remember hearing get to Bali, get to Bali, get to Bali, get to Bali, get to Bali. And it just kept coming up and getting louder and louder and louder over the course of 2 years. And then towards the end, it was sort of like, get to Bali. And when all these worries were coming up about money and what I'm going to do and what career I'm going to choose, and is it going to push me back a couple of years and blah, 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 blah. There you go. There's the mind going off in
Yeah,
so many
yeah,
different
yeah.
directions. The gut feeling was get to Bali and let me do the rest. And it was this really weird sensation. So yeah, I moved here in September of last year, and funnily enough, up to that point, I had been. I don't know if anybody listening is familiar with the word scripting. For people who don't know, scripting is essentially where you pick a point in the future and you write as if you're how you want to be in that point of time. So say I were to pick June 2024, I would write as if I was in June 2024, or say a page, and just journal about my life as if it was the exact way that I would like it to be. So I was achieving everything that I wanted to, I was living how I wanted to. And you do it from a really grateful perspective and sort of appreciative perspective. And that sets up, it's very good for your mind, but it's also very good spiritually, because it sort of sets the template of for your mind to create how you want to create your life, if that makes any sense. So yeah, anyway, I had been scripting for 2 years up until that point about finding a mentor that was going to employ me and teach me how to set up a coaching business. Lo and behold, the minute I arrived in Bali, she was right in front of me, and that's exactly what she did. So yeah, I'm really grateful to her, but that's why I feel like it was such a divine sort of alignment of where I was supposed to be. And since then have been sort of taking on clients and building my coaching business from there. So
Yeah, 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 yeah. And so you mentioned that you were looking to find a mentor in Bali. Was there anything else that you were hoping to gain from the move?
to be honest, no, I kept telling people before moving that I just wanted to be out here as long as I was happy and had money. I really left the doors open. I had no idea what Bali was like. The only thing I knew was people telling me that I would love it. And turns out I bloody do. But also that like I just wanted to experience doing something different. Like I'd lived a very conventional lifestyle, of sort of working, going to college, going to uni, and I was really sick of just doing what I thought I should do. So I was like, let's just take a complete left turn and go and do something that was really going to scare the shit out of my dad, which is move across the world, use some savings meant for a house deposit, and see what happens. So yeah.
Yeah, sometimes that's when the best things in life are made, though.
Exactly.
Yeah. What do you think abled you to make that move? I'm thinking because it's very scary for a lot of people, and I think a lot of people will want to do something similar. You know, the idea of living in Bali, the idea of taking this sort of bold leap of faith, this risk, I think is very appealing. And you know, the modern world isn't appealing for a lot of people. Working 9 to 5 isn't appealing. People want to start their own businesses. So I'm trying to think and get into the minds of those types of people, and yeah, really think about what their reservations would be. And I'm sure you had reservations before you did it, but how did you overcome those? And yeah, were there any strategies to help you do so?
So I'm going to reference something that we call in the coaching world as the pain pleasure model. And I'm pretty sure we've discussed it before in the past, but it's essentially the idea that like we associate doing something big, i.e. changing jobs or moving countries or leaving a relationship, as like painful because it's unfamiliar. But we basically associate with where we are, which is comfort zone, as pleasure, because it's like, okay, if I just stay here, then I'm safe. Whereas if you actually attempt to switch those two and you say that, okay, if you were to stay exactly where you were in that stagnant relationship, in that job that you're not fulfilled in that country that you're not happy in, if you were to stay there for the next 6 months to a year, how would you feel? And that person goes, oh my God, awful. And you go, why? And it's like, because I feel stagnant. I feel like I haven't made a move. And then what you do is you reverse that model where you say, actually, staying where you are is more painful. And making the leap, doing the thing that's sort of unfamiliar and feels unsafe, is actually probably going to be more pleasurable, because you're doing something for yourself and really leaning into self-trust in the sort of area of like, okay, whatever happens, I know that I can do whatever I can to serve myself. Um, and I will tell you from experience of living with everyone out here that like 99.9% of the time, the thing that is really scary and the thing that you feel is going to feel like the ground is just falling beneath your feet is actually the best move for you.
Mm.
Because you really have to lean into self-trust. You really have to lean into trust of the world, and just hope that there's a safety net, or just hope that there's going to be some sort of lifeline. And like 9 times out of 10, there is. Um, I can't speak for every scenario because I've not lived everyone's lifetimes, but for mine in particular, I can definitely say that like the best, this is going to sound so cliche, the best version of you is on the other side of your biggest fear.
Mm.
And that's because you really understand what it means to live when you feel you're close to death.
Wow.
That's a big one.
People are the most unhappy when they feel the least able to challenge what they see as fearful. And without knowing, without understanding what you're capable of, you know, it's there's that old adage, it's the true hell is when you look in the mirror and realize the person that you could actually be. I think I've paraphrased that. That's not the exact quote, but that's what resonates with me when you said that, because not doing something out of fear is almost worse than doing the thing out of fear and it not going very well. If you had never moved to Bali and you'd always been wondering what if, then you believe you're not capable of making that step, and therefore that's your sort of marker for who you think you are and what you think you're capable of. But by challenging, by going ahead step by step, it's proven to you that you are strong, that you can do this. Does that make sense?
100%. Yeah, it really does. Like, one of the phrases that really resonates with me is that people get so scared of dying that they stop living. Um, and I think that that's particularly true. But also, I think I'd like to mention here, there's two types of fear, or there's a scale of fear, let's say. And I think there's a fear where it feels like absolute death, and you're like, your whole nervous system goes into panic mode, and that's when people get panic attacks. And that needs a little bit of patience, that needs a little bit of holding, that needs some presence, and some acknowledgement and some regulating. Or there's a sort of fear, again, this is another cat and toddler analogy of like, you're either completely dysregulated and you're not able to take a step forward and you need complete presence and some sort of support, or there's sort of like, I don't really want to do that because it's making me hot and sweaty, which, as we all know, like, stress is a very good indicator that like you care about something and that you want something to go well, which is a good sign. But I think something that I really got annoyed with when I was, sorry, a skier. Something that I really got annoyed with during my journey was when I kept having people waggle the finger at me and say, do it when you're scared, like feel the fear and do it anyway, sort of thing. And it was like, how can I, whenever I take a step forward, I have a fucking full-blown panic attack? So that was something that really kind of aggravated me along my journey. So I think it's really important to know the difference between those two. And I think, yeah, taking the step forward should be done when you're in a state of like, this is scaring me, but I know I can do it.
Mm. You've got to build up a foundation of trust within yourself before you can make some wild and crazy move. I think and maybe this is just coming from myself, who is incredibly calculated, but I've clearly got a bit more work to do on self-trust. But essentially, I would see it as, yeah, you're exactly right. Build up steps to doing something really scary. And it's not actually about, let's say if it is moving to Bali, actually getting on that flight and flying across the various oceans and countries you need to get there, is probably not actually the scariest part. It's more the commitment to do so in the first place, and the telling your friends, the family, what will they think, all of these things. There are so many different elements to the journey and to the story that would be difficult. And, depending on the individual, it's going to depend which one they feel like is the hardest one. Some people would be, the disconnect from friends and family. Others, it would be meeting new people. I'm sure it'd be different, but it's about putting building blocks in place to give you the best chance possible so that it will work out. And I relate within my own experience to having quite a lot of anxiety over presenting. And it was only ever when I had slides in front of me, as opposed to, being on like a call at work, or whether that's external, internal. If it was just notes, I'd be absolutely fine and I could conduct myself in the right manner. But the really hard one was when I had to present something in an order, in a set structure, because I put that self-perceived pressure on myself that I had to say things in exactly the right way. And ultimately, it didn't align with the type of approach I usually take as a human, which is I need to be told how to get or to go somewhere, and then I make my own way, as opposed to having to do things in a set structure, in a set place. I like having that freedom to move. And I found it really hard. And the big pressure in front of me was, as I'm about to speak, for the first few seconds, I would hear my voice go. I could tell that I was nervous. My heart was pounding, was racing. And I was so worried about literally like having a panic attack at the beginning of this call and not being able to speak. And, by just challenging myself and doing one immediately in person in front of 50 people, well, that's not probably going to be very successful for me because it's too much too soon. But you build some blocks in place. You start by doing it with 2 people, then with 4 people, then, or challenging yourself and making the situations harder before actually trying to do a presentation in person. So an example of this, which I did with my team, was we would practice a presentation for literally a minute and then have to present it 2 minutes later. So you've barely had a chance to even see what this presentation is. You don't really know what's on the slides, but it's all about, can you try and, use your intuition to put yourself in the best position possible, trying to replicate that scenario of forgetting what you're saying, or, making your training situation harder so that ultimately when you actually go to do the presentation in person and you've presented, you've practiced even, it's easier than what you've trained for. And those are some of the building blocks that I put in place before ultimately presenting, externally and in person, etc. And it definitely helped. I still felt my heart racing like crazy. Those feelings were all still there, but I think, as you say, you've got that foundation to build from, to trust yourself with that, and then you move forward.
100%. And I think one of the main things I'd come back to when it comes to any sort of personal development healing journey is just all your body/nervous system wants to know is that it's safe. And I think what we don't realize is just fear is an amalgamation of us feeling unsafe. And what happens is when you build those blocks, another version of that could be, for me, those blocks were essentially having my deepest and most vulnerable parts of myself exposed, and someone, i.e. a therapist, sitting opposite me and saying, it's okay. It's okay for you to be this way. It's okay for you to express this way. It's okay for you to feel this. And so slowly but surely my nervous system started to regulate, and I learned to trust myself and my intuition and my responses to things. And that's when it then became safer for me to start making bold moves in my career, in sort of like deciding to move country. But 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, I was so dysregulated that like doing anything as big as this would have knocked me for 6, and really put me on my ass. excuse the Bristolian twang there.
Came through.
But I think that's also why, like, this, like, fire and ice therapy, you mentioned Wim Hof earlier. One of the most powerful tools that everybody is now using is cold water therapy. And the reason for that being so powerful is because essentially what happens is you put your body in a scenario where it feels completely out of sorts, where it's like, oh my God, what's going on? And then what happens is through breathing, you teach it that you're safe. And so what happens is in life, you then go, okay, I can put myself in scenarios where I feel completely out of sorts and teach myself that I'm okay. So it just comes back to that thing of like feeling safe in more and more environments and expanding your comfort zone, let's say, by just doing things that were once unfamiliar and making them feel safe. And that's how you expand your consciousness and your experience of reality. Is like, okay, that feels unfamiliar, let me try it. Okay, I feel safe. Then you do it over and over and over again, and then it becomes part of your comfort zone, you know?
I love that idea of like transferred knowledge. I, if I can sit in an ice bath for a minute and calm my breathing, on the surface of it, you think, well, how would that help when, you're having a panic attack or when you're, feeling really stressed? But actually it's proving to yourself you can do something hard. And whether that hard thing, is sitting in an ice bath, or it's being in a sauna for 25 minutes, or whether it's just being able to regulate yourself when you're feeling really uptight and you're feeling stressed, that you can transfer that knowledge from one thing to another. And it doesn't necessarily have to be within that same realm of fear or misunderstanding. And I'm actively thinking now about other ways that you can do that, but whether that's an existential challenge, i.e. moving country, or whether, I guess actually that's the question. Has moving country meant that you've built more confidence within yourself?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the rules of coaching is that if you can do something in one area, you can do it in all of them. And that means that, like, let's say, for example, in one area of your life, you're able to offer yourself self-love, i.e. when you visit your parents and you're feeling really overwhelmed / annoyed, and you're able to go, okay, I deserve love here. You can then do the same thing when you're sort of looking at yourself in the mirror and criticizing your body. So if you can do something in one area, you can do it in all of them. So I think when it came to being bold and moving across the country, something that I was really experiencing was a little bit of transgenerational trauma, in that, like, both of my parents, one of my parents was really afraid of losing loved ones. That was something he'd experienced in his lifetime. And my other parent had never left her hometown. So it was like I had these two parents that were trying to kind of bubble wrap me. My mum was cheering me on, but she was still terrified. So as I did it, I was experiencing so much fear, but I also felt so liberated at the same time. And that's a good indication that you're doing something that's good for you, is that, like, I'm fucking terrified, but this is also really fun. So yeah, I would definitely say that getting here, combined with like a lot of jet lag, I had a bit of a 4-day meltdown. And I kind of was in like this sort of state of like, where am I? What am I doing? How have I just shipped everything I own to one place and decided I'm going to live here? I've never been here before. I don't know anything about the culture. That was in my mind. And yeah, after that, I started to just really fall in love with the place and actually learn so much about myself, as you say, because I was in such a foreign environment. And sort of going back to what we said about the learning to feel safe, ice baths put your body in a scenario where it feels under a lot of stress, and you're essentially teaching it that stress is okay. And the same is true for sort of moving abroad, and why traveling is so liberating for people. And the first reason for that is because you are putting yourself in a scenario that feels really stressful, and you're learning to regulate yourself. I think the other reason that people find traveling so cool is because they meet so many open-minded people of throw that one in there as well.
Mm.
For anybody thinking of going traveling. But yeah, that would be my answer. I'd say 100%, because it was essentially putting myself in the, what is it they call it, the hot I was putting myself in the hot seat,
Mm.
and then learning to regulate myself and learning to feel comfortable.
Mm. Yeah, it's really interesting that you say it was a weird mixture between fear and excitement, because I remember reading a study where it says the biological response of being excited and being fearful is identical. And the only thing that really, distinguishes the two is what you perceive the surroundings as. Yeah. I.e., your mentality, your perspective. So it's amazing how reframing something as fearful, being excited, can actually have quite powerful implications. I.e., I'm excited to do this, or I'm excited to share this knowledge with you. It can have, massive implications. The burning question for me is, what is next for Meredith Cairns-Palmer? What's on the agenda?
What a great question. What's really interesting is that I've spent the last 8 months really sort of staying open in my coaching career as to where I'd like to go with it. Sort of, I've known that I wanted to work with women. I've known that I've wanted to work with women that have been through sort of similar things that I've been through, because that's where I feel I can offer the most impact. So I sort of reached a point the other day after going through a lot of grief. I find that like my best and biggest ideas have always come when I've been at the depths of something and I've just kind of surrendered. So at the depths of some grief last week, I sort of looked up at the sky and went, okay, I give up. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to step forward, like help effectively. And ironically, the next day I woke up with the biggest and best idea I've had in a really, really long time. And it feels like what I've been searching for in the last 8 months, which is really refining my niche and learning who I want to work with. So what's coming up next for me is I'm building a platform. I'm not going to say the name just yet, because I'm going to be announcing it soon on my social media.
BBC.
But yeah, I'm working on a platform essentially that is for people very much like you and I. And the idea is that I'm going to have a podcast. I'm going to be running a coaching program and sort of group mentorship. And I'm just going to use it as a place for sort of content, but mainly have it as a sort of community where people sort of share their experiences if they sort of resonate with this idea. And yeah, that's sort of where I'm going. I'm not going to say too much because I really want to savor.
Keep it coy. Keep it coy. No, how exciting. And yeah, I think it's always lovely to have a platform, or I was going to say platform. It's always lovely to have a project, something that you're putting your heart and soul into. You say that you've been through some grief recently. What are you happy to share what that would be?
I witnessed one of my friends going through something really, really hard. And it triggered me in a way that I didn't know I could be triggered. It's hard to touch too much on the subject without sort of saying too much, because it's not my place. But essentially, I reached a lot of sort of fear around my mortality and my it sort of makes you stare in the mirror and go, how certain is my future? How certain are my family's futures? And that's something that's really kind of heavy and hard hitting when you're faced with death. So yeah, it was something that I wasn't expecting. I witnessed quite a lot of pain in one of my friends, and it really stirred up a lot for me. And so I sort of reached quite a dark place. But what happens for me now is that it happens really quickly, as opposed to being like months or weeks on end. I'm sort of like, okay, I'm feeling this, let's dive in. And I just sort of sit with myself and hold myself there without any distractions or sort of coping mechanisms, let's say. And so what happened was is I sort of cried for like a day or an evening, and then the next day or that night I sort of said like, oh my God, like this is really hard, like help. And that was when the next day I sort of found this idea, um, which really has nothing to do with like what I was processing, but has really sort of provided an anchor for me to know sort of what direction I'm taking myself. And that alone has been a real nice answer to that sort of cry for help and that surrender. So, yeah.
Yeah. And, I'm sure we all have people that go through incredibly hard times. And it's something I think we've actually discussed previously is how do you best support someone in that situation? When and it will likely depend on what's happened to that individual, but how do you suggest, or how did you try and support that individual in the best way possible?
It was really tough, because this particular individual is just so close to my heart. Um, and so witnessing someone you care about so deeply like experience so much pain is really excruciating. Um, but ultimately you identify the fact that you care about them so much that all you want to do is help. And if help is just being able to hold them, like maybe even just get them water or just flowers or presents, just to be with them and just say, I'm just here. Whatever you need, I'm here. Um, I think one of the most sort of poignant things I've ever said to a friend who asked me this same question was like, you can't drag them out of the darkness, but you can hold their hand. Um, and I think there are certain scenarios where someone might ask for your advice and say, what do I do about this scenario? And if you do know, you can say, well, I would do this. But quite often, I think what we'll find is that people don't want advice when they're experiencing deep pain. They just want to be held and to know that their feelings are valid, that their experience is normal, and that they're going to be okay. And sometimes you can't even guarantee that for them. All you can do is that say that in this moment, I'm here. Um, and like, I can't guarantee what's going to happen in the future, but right here, right now, you're safe.
Mm.
Um, and I think for people experiencing their own really tough and deep emotions, one of the biggest things I heard that changed the game for me was like, if I'm still, I'm safe. So
Mm.
even when things feel like they're falling apart, when you're extremely anxious, extremely sad, extremely like in grief, anger, whatever it is, one of the things that I kind of come back to is that if I'm still, I'm safe.
What do you mean by that, out of interest? Still being in mind, i.e., when I'm like with myself, when I'm in my space, I'm safe.
Yeah, so I suppose if you're experiencing a really hard emotion, something that's really kind of challenging you and your nervous system feels completely dysregulated, I think like kind of going back to that feeling of safety thing, if you can pull yourself away, like i.e. if you're at work, go to a toilet cubicle, or if you're at the gym, same scenario, or if you're at home, just take yourself to your bedroom. Um, Quite often it can feel like emotions are just taking over you and being completely overwhelming, and you're like, oh my God, what's happening? So a sort of mantra that can bring you back is that like, if I'm sat still, I'm safe.
Mm.
Like nothing can affect me, or like the floor isn't going to cave in, like I'm safe. um and I think another thing to kind of add in there is the fact that if something does want to move, i.e. if you do feel extreme anger and you want to punch a pillow or scream, that's also okay. um but in terms of just feeling safe and sort of removing that overwhelming feeling, it's like that mantra of just like, okay, if I'm still, I'm safe. I'm
Mm.
still.
I like that. I think there's also a part to play in terms of people often like compensate for feeling uncomfortable with being overly energetic and overly active. I if the more uncomfortable you are within yourself, the more that you fidget, the more that you feel like there's a lot of movement, etc. And yeah, it's ultimately to compensate. But actually, if you can be still despite all of this wider emotion, this harder feeling, it actually allows you to process your emotions and the feeling that you've got in the first place. Um, and yeah, I think I like that mantra a lot. I'm going to try and be weaving that into my little life at some point, because I'm a bit frantic and I like going all over the place and moving about from one way to another, as you've probably experienced. Yeah, no, I like that. Well, I hope they're all okay anyway, and thank you for sharing that. It's interesting you say about just holding someone's hand in the dark, because Simon Sinek has a very similar analogy, which is sitting with someone else in the mud. They just want to sit in the mud with someone else. They don't want to be dragged out. They don't want their clothes to be washed and cleaned for them and pressed and ironed. They just want to be sat next to you, knowing that you're there. And part of that process is actually leaving them there as well. The success is not getting them out the mud. It's proving that you can sit in it with them and not make it about yourself. And I think that's something that people find really hard to do, because they feel like they either have a moral obligation to have some sort of help or impact on that person's life at that specific time, or they want to feel better about themselves because they want to feel like they've helped someone. So whether it's for positive or for negative reasons, the outcome usually is the same, and it's usually not positive if you're trying to fix, if you're trying to have more of an impact than you can have at that time. It's up to the individual to really dive into themselves and their own emotions with support, with help, and also for them to reach out to you when they feel like they do need advice, they do need help. And usually the best way to do so is actually just by waiting for them to say, I don't know what to do. Can you please help me with this decision? But it has to come from them. And I think if it doesn't, the information often isn't received and processed very well.
Yeah, or even just like not like even before a decision, if it's just like deep grief or deep pain or like deep trauma release, the point is exactly as you've said, like not to try and pull them out of it, or not to sort of try and fix them, but to understand that they've got to ask for help in the first place, and they might do that in a multitude of different ways, and b being support for them, but not becoming sort of their crutch, like allowing them to understand that their biggest empowerment is going to be them clambering out of the mud themselves, washing their own clothes, sort of doing it for themselves. Because if you're sort of telling them what steps to make and like holding their hand all the way through the process, they're then relying on you, and that's not empowering at all. That's just codependency. So I think another thing I want to add there is like someone who has not held their own pain will not be able to hold you in yours. And that's something that's really present among relationships, is that like as empathetic human beings, if we see or witness someone in extreme pain and we haven't looked at ours, it's going to be the most triggering thing ever. So we're going to respond to them the same way that we have been responding to ourselves. So it's going to be like, yeah, okay, we're just going to move forward. You're going to do this, and we're going to go here, and yeah, you're going to be absolutely fine. I'm going to get you a coffee, and we're going to be, yeah, you're going to read that book, and yeah, everything's fine. And you can imagine how that feels for someone who's going through deep grief. They're going to be like, great, thanks. Like, I've just lost my dad. I don't want to read a book or have a coffee. Like, so for, especially in the personal development world, this is also something that's really damaging for the reputation of coaches, is people who sort of qualify as coaches before going through their own shit and being able to hold their own pain. Because when someone then comes to them with a serious sort of painful issue, they're going to do exactly that, which is, okay, we're just going to switch that mindset, going to change that belief, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, that can be really, really damaging for someone who's just opened up something really vulnerable. And actually, all they need is for someone to just say, it's okay. Like, it's okay for you to be here. But you cannot do that as a person if you've not done that for yourself. And it's extremely triggering to see that, because you'll go, oh my God, I haven't visited that part of myself and I can't do that for you. Do you know what I mean?
I do. And it's interesting because when you were saying that, all I was thinking was, if every coach, every therapist went along those lines, i.e. the incorrect ones, you would just be the ultimate product of your therapist. You'd be the same person, you'd develop in the same ways that they do. You'd essentially morph into them and their coping mechanisms. But their job isn't to tell you what they would do. Their job is to hold a mirror up to yourself and say, okay, who am I? What do I do? How do I do it?
Yeah. And that's why, like, being in touch with your relationship with yourself is the biggest and best relationship that you'll ever build in your life. And you can't do that whilst you're mirroring things or like doing something that someone else has told you. Maybe you're trying it out and you've tried out some other methods as well. And that's when you figure out what you like best. But if you're literally just mirroring someone's like every move, then you are just going to become a replica of them. You know, you're going to have the same trauma responses, coping mechanisms. Like it's not going to be a true empowering experience because you're not honoring who you are. You're just mirroring.
And you'll never learn it. You know, I think you need to build those tools yourself. You can be given the raw materials, but you need to actually create something that works for you. And having too much support and leaning too much on other people will never ultimately push you to really, to mold those tools. And you have those tools for life. And I often think that when I go through a hard situation or a difficult period, I've always got more tools than I went into it. I've always got more tools than when I first went into that difficult period afterwards. And, I wouldn't give that up for anything. I think there hasn't been a single period in my life where, after a really tough time, and once I've reflected and I've got a bit of hindsight on it, that I've not thought, yeah, I kind of needed that. I kind of needed at least not the situation. Obviously, I don't want to wish, harm on myself or anyone else. But I think more specifically when I'm struggling mentally just with my own shit, that's when I've thought, no, I need that. That's when I needed a bit of a nudge. I needed a bit of a kick in the right direction because I was becoming, maybe a bit complacent or a little bit like, I was stagnating maybe. And I think that's an interesting thought. I mean, it doesn't really help when you're feeling bad and when you're in the mud and you're just like, why the hell am I here? I don't want to be here. I want to be happy. I want to feel elated. But in hindsight, sometimes actually it does have some sort of helpful benefit.
Well, yeah, and I think that is really that's a beautiful point to kind of close on. It's like, I don't believe that square one exists. And this is something like, when I asked you what we were going to talk on the podcast, you said, like, what have you sort of been thinking about recently that you'd love to sort of bring forward? And that thing for me at the moment is like, square one doesn't exist. Like, you can never go back to square one because you as a person can't physically go backwards. Nothing in nature can go backwards. Even if you feel like you're revisiting something from your past, you will have learned new experiences, learned new coping strategies, grown as a person physically, emotionally, spiritually, even just a little bit. And that will mean that you'll deal with that situation ever so slightly different, even though it feels like the world has ended and that you're in ground zero or whatever it is. Like, square one does not exist. You cannot go backwards. And that's something that like is so important to remember when you're feeling shitty, is that you will never go backwards. You will always progress in some way. And like the really challenging scenarios are the ones that teach you the most. And I think a podcast that I listened to recently was like talking about how most of the most traumatic things that happen in our life, we look back and go, wow, that really taught me something. Wow, that really changed who I was as a person. And normally it's for the better.
Meredith, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. That really was amazing. No, really appreciate your honesty and openness. Something I was very, very excited to share with whoever wants to listen. Of course, I will pop everything in the description, and when the platform is ready, please let me know and I'll share it as well.
Thank you so much for having me. I've had such a lovely time.
You're more than welcome. Take care.
Bye.